This is my second talk about the microbiome in the past few weeks. I started doing this work about 3 years ago, and I have waited this long to talk because usually I'm used to talking about things that I know a lot about and I feel really comfortable. And people have been asking me, like, how did you get interested in this? Why are you doing this? And so I have been thinking about that a lot over the past few weeks. And I would say probably 3 different things came together. One is, in my real world, I'm a TBI researcher, so traumatic brain injury researcher. And if you've been in the Department of Veterans Affairs or the DoD for the past 10 years, you know that a lot of time and energy has been spent thinking about, is it TBI or PTSD? And I spent a large chunk of my career trying to help figure out if it was TBI or PTSD. And then at some point, I just got so tired of thinking about, is it one or the other? Can we think of something that is common to both that would help us mechanistically, what underlies both of these things? And so then I started thinking about inflammation, and then that led me to this. So that was one reason. The other reason is, if you're familiar with traumatic brain injury research and mental health research, so I meet some people in academia, they think I'm a suicide researcher. I meet some people in the world who think I'm a TBI researcher, and now some people think I'm a microbiome researcher. So if you're familiar with the mental health literature and the TBI literature, our clinical trials aren't going exactly as we hope. And I think, particularly in the TBI world, we had lots and lots of negative clinical trials, which I'm supposed to tell you means not positive findings. It means that the intervention doesn't work, or the intervention doesn't work any better than sham. And so I started to think about, maybe we're not looking at everything we need to be looking at that will help us understand why people benefit from different interventions. So that was the second thing that got me interested in this. And the third thing, I've decided it was like a midlife crisis, that I needed to have a new research area, and so microbiome is my midlife crisis. And I think it's a pretty benign one so far, but I'll keep you posted. Everything I say today, you should already know this is all me, not the VA. And this is Andy's slide. I stole it from him. But what I want to articulate today is how exciting this research is, how much potential I think there is. And obviously, a lot of other people think there's a lot of potential too. Yet I think we're struggling with the potential versus what we really know, right? And what we really know, as I'm going to show you in terms of human models and translating the microbiome to human research, is really very limited. And to be honest, there's not even that many people out there that are trying to do this in human models. Everybody's always like, oh, you're an animal researcher? I'm like, no, I'm a human researcher. And they're like, oh. And so there aren't very many of us even trying this in human models because human models are so messy and we know so little about this. So as Andy would say, he pulled this from the Web of Science, and you can see in 2004, almost nobody publishing on the microbiome, and then 2015, way up there. I would say if you do a review of these, there's a lot of animal models, there's a lot of theoretical papers, there's a lot of basic science. There's very little human subjects research happening in this area. Okay, so then, I initially start to get interested in this, and I start thinking, this is what I need to learn, right? And it feels pretty overwhelming, right? Because if we're going to move this into human subjects research, we need to get this in a way that human subjects researchers can start to understand it. And so at first I was just totally overwhelmed and intimidated because I'm not this kind of scientist. But then what I've realized is actually you all are not my kind of scientist. And I know a lot of stuff that you don't know about clinical trials. So what I'm going to be talking about today mostly is about clinical trials and outcome measures and how do you pick outcome measures. Because that seems like a really important basic place to start if we're going to be collaborating and doing more translational work. And Andy already talked today about some of the measures we picked. A psychologist who is very interested in psychometrics cringes when people say, I develop my own measure. So if you want to collaborate with somebody, don't say you develop your own measure. Health sciences researchers, psychologists don't like that. And you'll see some of why today. So how do you take this, and how do you even start to think about this? And then this is the kinds of articles I'm starting to read, right? This is showing up on the printer at the lab, and Kelly's like, what are we doing? Why are you printing articles that look like this? This is not what we do. And I was going to say at the beginning, and I forgot, but Andy alluded to the fact that a lot of MyRec folks really helped make this happen, and I want to name those people, so I'm going to take a break. This is a commercial break. Kelly Stearns, right here. Kate Cochran, I don't know where Kate is. Kate, are you there? Kate back there. They helped with all the logistics, and it's really important. I did almost nothing other than get the grant with folks. They did everything, even though they said it was me, it was really them. And then Rachel made the beautiful program and is doing the videography. and Adam Hoffberg and Joe Huggins are doing our social media and Periscope today. So maybe you can help me by giving them a round of applause, because they're really the ones who do everything. Yay, Kate. See, she's, yeah, okay. So these kinds of things are showing up in my printer, and and then this kind of data, which I'm like, what does this even mean? How do I even begin to think about this? And how do I begin to think about this in a way that not only I want to be interested in this, I'm really motivated, it's midlife crisis data to look at, but other health sciences researchers that are not having the same compulsion to do this, how do I get them to be interested in this? How do I translate this into something that could actually be meaningful to the work that they're doing? And so Andy showed this before. This is me, right? This little box right here, that's me. That's what I do. And what I would love to see, my wish, is that as we see more and more microbiome of the built environment studies go forward, you all are partnering with people like me to look at that box too, and that we're doing that in an evidence-based manner. Okay, and so a lot of the learning that I've done in the past couple years has come from Andy and also Chris Lowry. And so trying to find ways to explain how this might apply to health. And you've already heard some of this today about the gut-brain axis, but this idea, this failure of immunoregulation is something that medical providers, physicians, nurses, they can get their head wrapped around this. This language makes sense to them. So if I'm going from this does not make sense to healthcare providers, right? They're like, I don't know what you're talking about. But getting to this does make sense to them. And this idea that we have a problem with chronic inflammatory disorders that's thought to be attributable to exposure to the reduced diversity of the microbial environment with which we co-evolved. People can understand that work in medical care. And they can also understand this idea of immune system at birth, and this is all from one of Chris's papers, this immune system at birth, and that we actually need to be exposed to things, as we've heard about today, that Jack was talking about in terms of how do we have good exposure and bad exposure, how do we expose people to things that helps them have a well-functioning immunoregulatory system. Okay, so once I say that to healthcare providers, they're like, I'm totally on board. And then we can start talking about this idea that this diversity is happening not just in the environment, but it's happening in each person. And there's different ways we can measure this in each person. And healthcare providers and healthcare researchers like the idea of measuring things, and they're starting to say like, oh, okay, I get it. Those graphs are actually just related to different parts of the body that I'm very familiar with, and they might help me think about chronic neuroinflammation and chronic inflammation. And then I can specifically talk to them about the diseases that they see in their practice all the time that they don't know what to do about, right? Because the things that healthcare providers and physicians in particular hate is not knowing what to do, right? And some of these conditions we don't know what to do about, right? Particularly the chronic autoimmune diseases. And then I can start to move them away from stuff that makes perfect sense to them and start talking to them about things like psychiatric disorders, mental health disorders, and even recovery from traumatic brain injury, which is really my wheelhouse. And this is how we kind of get everybody on the same page that perhaps, the big perhaps, this is an important area for us all to be looking at together. And so that's what I am pitching to people that I work with every day. What I want to pitch to you all is this idea that people have spent a lot of time designing clinical trials, designing epidemiological trials, designing randomized clinical trials, and then also designing outcome measures. And that these outcome measures are out there for you to use. You do not need to develop your own measures. You do not need to recreate this wheel. This wheel is here for you, and there's tons of resources for you to be able to use. And so this basically, I think some of you might know this. How many have done clinical trials research? Human subjects clinical trial research. Oh, see, that's good. I'm glad I'm talking about this. Okay. So what you have here, right, here's an intervention in the population that I'm really interested in this case, is individuals with major depressive disorder. So I already know that I have several things I need to do. I need to figure out how am I going to identify individuals that have major depressive disorder. Am I just going to say to people, hey, do you have major depressive disorder? No, I'm not going to do that, right? That's not going to work. And then I want to think about my outcome. So if my intervention in this case is a probiotic, right? I have a proximal outcome, which is an outcome that's closer to the intervention, and then I'm going to have a distal outcome, which is increased function. Okay, those sound good. Funders, NIH is going to like that. They're going to like that I'm looking at depression and then increased outcome. But how am I going to measure those things? Well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to people who do this research. I'm going to find out that there is a psychometrically sound way to measure all psychiatric conditions using a structured clinical interview. I don't need to make this up. This exists. Your staff or you can be trained on this. It's not rocket science. It does take some practice. Yes, it takes some practice. But this is out there. And then when I write my paper, I can say, hey, I did the gold standard for identifying individuals with major depressive disorder. And no one's going to argue with me. They can argue with me about the other parts of the science, but no one's going to argue with me about this, which is great. Because with this kind of science, I think there is going to be lots of question marks. So let's close the question marks down anywhere we can. And identifying those with major depressive disorder, we don't have to go light on that. Okay, so how am I going to pick these measures, particularly related to my outcomes? So first of all, I want to think about what is my population of interest. There's lots of measures out there. Ideally, the measures that I would be using have been used with that population before, right? So if I want to do a measure of depressed mood, and the measure I kind of like has only been used in kids, and I want to use it in combat veterans, that's not a good choice, right? I mean, that seems basic. You would not believe how many papers come across my desk that people aren't making basic good choices about outcomes. So has the measure been used before with this cohort? And does it have reliability and validity? I know you all think about reliability and validity, right? So this idea that it measures the same thing every time, and that how consistent are the results, and does it actually measure what I want it to measure? So back to my major depressive disorder, if I say to somebody, do you have major depressive disorder? Odds are I'm not going to identify all the people that I would like that do have major depressive disorder. I'll miss some, and I will miss them for different reasons, okay? So I want to make sure that I'm actually getting the right people in the study. And then the last thing is, what is my budget? Some measures are more expensive than others, right? So if I'm working with a doctoral student and they're doing a project and they have no budget, I might pick different psychometrically sound measures than I would if I had a big budget. Okay, so here's a couple examples that I want to give you. So this is the Beck Depression Inventory 2. Most of the measures I'm going to give you today are self-report measures. These are widely used. I mean, this is like really widely used measures. You're never going to have to argue with anybody about did you really measure depressive symptoms if you use the Beck Depression Inventory 2. Same with the SF-36, thousands of articles with thousands of populations about health functioning. So I could go with these two measures, very traditional, nobody would argue with them. But then I could get fancy and think, hey, I'm going to go for NIH funding. The NIH has created a toolbox of measures that they want me to be using. And in this toolbox, all the measures are developed and validated. They're based on a nationally representative sample. They're well suited for measuring longitudinal studies so that they have multiple versions of the measures, and they're available in many different languages. So then I started to think, hey, I think I'm going to use these. I can also download these measures on platforms like a tablet and use those very easily to measure the outcomes I'm looking for. There's a lot of toolkits like this. Are people familiar with these toolkits? Oh, good, then I'm really glad we're talking about this today. Okay, so the NIH toolbox in particular has measures of motor control, emotional functioning, sensation, and cognition. And you can see that it gives very specific descriptions of each of these and has a number of different measures in the different domains that you want to be using. If you're also a grant reviewer or a funder, or if you do peer review work, once you see things like the NIH toolbox, you know that people are using the measures they should be using, and you can move through that section. There's also the PROMIS measures. Who's heard about PROMIS measures? Okay, you're the winner. You must do you do health human subjects research? You're a psychologist, woo! Yeah, okay. So PROMIS are also measures that are great. They're more focused on function, and that you can see that they have things like pain quality, pain behavior, also lots of social health outcomes, so maybe some more distal things. They have very brief measures and longer measures. So they have this toolkit. They also have toolkits like this, or toolboxes for neurologic disorders, suicide-related outcomes. All these toolkits exist out there for you. Almost all of them are free. All right, so that if you're not using these and you're doing human subjects research, that doesn't make as much sense to me as it could. And so then the other thing I want to talk about, and people were asking me, this is the figure around CTE. Somebody was asking me about CTE before, which is not related to this talk, which is chronic traumatic encephalopathy. But this shows you what the problem is with lots of our studies. So this is a more epidemiological model, not a randomized clinical trial. And what you have is exposure, and I think it was on your slides, right? You were talking about exposure this morning. Yes, you were. I love that slide. Okay, so you have exposure, right? And we don't know whether this exposure, if this is microbiome exposure, is what we're talking about here. It could be traumatic brain injury, concussions in football. It could be a lot of different things. Whatever the exposure is. And this is short here, but maybe this is, you know, during childhood. Maybe this is over the course of a lifetime. How am I going to measure what I'm interested in the individual having exposure to, right? And then I have this period of when the exposure stops. And I have the beginning of an outcome, right? So let's say in this case it's depressed mood. It's not depression, it's beginning signs of depressed mood. That's the start of the outcome, right? And then I don't have the diagnosis still here. So this is called the induction period. This is called the latent period. This is basic epidemiology. We have not done almost any kind of work like this in this field. Jack just told me about a study that he's doing right now that's beginning some of this work, but really I think limited work where we're able to look longitudinally and classify exposure over time, whether that's exposure to buildings, exposure to water, exposure to the environment, exposure to stressors, and be able to look at the kinds of outcomes that we're interested in long term. And I would say that I think we're still a little bit far away from this kind of research. I mean, and certainly far away from knowing answers to this kind of research. I think maybe stuff's starting to happen, but I think we're still not totally clear all the time, even though some studies are underway already, and Jack's studies I'm sure are perfect. But sometimes we're not sure about what the exposure is that we're looking at, right? Are we looking at only the parents? Are we only looking at the environment? Are we only looking at I don't know what? So to be really clear about that, and then to be really clear about the things we're tracking over time. Okay, and let's say actually what I'm really interested here is TBI. I just wanted to show you this. There is a gold standard measure for a TBI or mild TBI, which is concussion. Mild TBI and concussion are the same thing. And what's really important is if I'm doing a study, and I said this before, if I'm doing a study on major depressive disorder or TBI or anything, that I'm really clear that I have the right cases, right? So this is called case ascertainment in epidemiology. You want to make sure that you actually have the cases. So if you're working with people overseas and they're looking at PTSD, you want to make sure you really have PTSD cases, right? And you want to ask them, how did you figure that out? How are you scoring measures? Okay, so like any good health services or human subjects researcher who's interested in TBI and PTSD, I wanted to see what has already been done already. Anyway, so I thought, okay, there's got to be a lot out there. And this was a huge effort, a joint effort for a lot of us, Chris Lowry, Kelly, myself. And so what we did is we looked, and Adam, of course, we looked at all studies, all human subject studies that had any history of TBI severity, so that's mild, moderate, and severe TBI, so that's TBI ranging from, I'll do a little side TBI lecture here. So TBI, traumatic brain injury, is an injury event with an alteration in consciousness. TBI can range from concussion or mild TBI, so that can feel like being dazed and confused after being hit, to being in a persistent vegetative state. Those are both called traumatic brain injury, hence lots of the problems with the research and everything else, because case ascertainment is really a mess with TBI, and there's no objective marker of mild TBI, but that is a totally different lecture for a different day. But we took any TBI and or any PTSD. So it could be TBI, PTSD, or both. And the reason I chose those two is because that's what I've spent a lot of my career doing, looking at traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress disorder, because those are the two signature injuries of individuals returning from Iraq and Afghanistan. So we're seeing lots of veterans who have TBI and PTSD. And we basically looked at any outcomes. So now you know what this means. We looked at any outcomes, anything. It could have been depression, it could have been mood, it could have been infection during hospitalization, any health-related outcomes. And what we found initially, we had 8,781 abstracts, which seems like, oh my gosh, there's going to be a lot out there. This is going to be really, really exciting. And you can see we got down to, at the end, 4 total articles in the history of the world on these conditions, okay, on clinical trials of any kind. So that gets back to that slide where I had that right, Web of Science. Would you have guessed 4? I should have played a game. I love games. You wouldn't have thought 4, right? You thought more than that, right? 4 total for PTSD and or TBI. Okay. So 4, 2 TBI probiotic study, 1 TBI prebiotic study, and one PTSD probiotic study. So for the sponsors out there, I think there's a lot of good work to be done. We'd like to do it, but no, there's just a lot of work that needs to be done. Okay, so this is a study that Andy talked about already. So I always think hypothesis 6 is me, right? So looking at this psychological stress and trying to figure out how that's related to our other areas of interest. I wanted to show you what these measures look like. They're not scary, they're not hard, they're easy, they're quick. So Andy already talked about the perceived stress scale. This is 14-item questionnaire. This is free, I'm pretty sure. Yes, it's free, it's psychometrically sound, and it's just questions like, in the last week, how often have you felt that things were going your way? Okay? We also did an insomnia scale. We use this scale all the time. This is actually the gold standard for insomnia, and we're using it in a clinical trial right now as one of the primary outcomes. But again, really easy, right, for people to fill out. These are not rocket science. You can give them in any platform, tablet, red cap, easy to use. Okay? I wanted to highlight, these are the other measures that we use, right, the patient health questionnaire. And if you were paying super close attention, which there's no reason you should have been paying this close of attention, you would have noticed that we gave the 8 instead of the 9, and that's because we took out the suicide question. There's a question in here that sometimes makes people feel anxious, and IRBs anxious. It's around a wish to not being alive anymore, so we took that out, and it's PHQ 8. Okay? And this is the outcome questionnaire 45. It looks at kind of psychosocial stressors of different sort. You can get an overall score, and then scores related to like family functioning and stuff. Okay. So then I wanted to tell you quickly about another grant. This is a huge effort. Teo, Andy, Kelly, myself, Carrie, Kinney, and we put in a grant looking at the biological signature and safety of a probiotic intervention, and that's L-Reuteri, on individuals with co-occurring mild TBI and PTSD. And I should say that part of the reason this research is a little bit hard to do here still is that probiotics are still considered an intervention that's regulated by the FDA. So if we were going to give this probiotic to anybody as for a specific medical indication, let's say we wanted to look at post-traumatic symptoms per se, rather than biological signatures, we would need an IND, which is a very long process. It's very challenging. I should highlight that we've even had some challenges getting medical clearance to do this. This is a probiotic that you can buy over the counter for babies with colic, yet it's making medical providers very anxious to sign medical clearance forms. So I think we still have a long way to go in terms of educating our communities about the importance of at least finding out more evidence about this. And one thing I like to say to providers is, your patients are spending a lot of money on this stuff already, and we don't know if it works at all, right? So we need to study it, and I know that's kind of hard to get comfortable with this. Seems like it's out of your wheelhouse, but it's not. We need to get together to be able to study it. So this study is currently underway. We're recruiting. Our population of interest is OIF veterans with co-occurring mild traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress disorder. And what we're doing is we're objectively measuring well-defined biological signatures, and this is where I've learned quite a bit of gut infection, gut permeability, and systemic inflammation. I never thought I'd feel comfortable talking about gut leakiness on a stage, but here I am talking about gut leakiness. And then we're going to see if they have an adequate impact on these biological signatures. We're going to look at human bioavailability, and then we're going to be looking at the feasibility, acceptability, and safety data regarding supplementation. It's interesting, whenever you're working with human subjects, we had a veteran who had a symptom several weeks ago that would not be related to a probiotic. I don't think it was a cold sore. He thought it was related to the cold sore. We said, thank you, we'll continue to keep track of it. So always interesting to see what people come up with, but so far so good, no big problems. Other than getting the medical clearance forms, no big problems. Okay, and so what you can see here, this is our consort diagram. We're having folks come in. One thing that we thought was really important is to only try this with folks who have increased inflammation in the first place. So if they don't have that, they're out. So everybody that does have that, they're coming in, we're giving them L-Reuteri, and then we're doing several time points of measures, and we're looking at things like IL-6 and TNF, stuff that I think folks who are studying inflammation would be very familiar with. The other thing we're doing to look at psychological stress response is at time 3, they're getting the Trier, which is a social stress test, and then we're going to be doing things like looking at galvanic skin response and psychological stress measures. And we're hoping that this will then help contribute to next steps. So the next person that does a systematic review will have a very nice randomized clinical trial done in the US that's actually beginning to look at this. Want to highlight the MBM core again, and thank you.